And I think it's natural for you to assume that there will be a little bit more weightage given to the latter half of the course because, you know, the first couple of weeks, obviously, things were being set up, an overview, that sort of thing. So I think, you know, you can use your own common sense here to determine to what extent the readings in the latter half of the course will be more important and the lectures will be more important in that sense. But some more weightage there, but nonetheless, the final exam does cover all 10 weeks, so you should try to keep abreast of the readings, and you know, if you missed some of the lectures, you can access them. There's absolutely no excuse for not being able to access the lectures because they're all being video streamed and audio podcasted. So I would suggest that you strongly access all the lectures and do the readings, and once you've done that, I think you're really well prepared for the final. Okay, there will be nothing on the final that will be outside what has been covered in class. Natalie, did you have a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a question about the paper Everybody Loves the Drought, and I was trying to understand his description of what are kind of like indigenous people and not indigenous people, and the people in the tribes.
Yeah.
Because it's easier to understand here in the Americas, the Native Americans
Yeah.
and the white man, but
Yeah.
I don't understand really the division within the Indian society.
Yeah.
Where is a tribe and where is like considered to be a
Non-tribe.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the word that is used in India, it's actually a Sanskrit word. So there's a first irony here, because remember that the tribal people are people who are outside the domain of what becomes dominant Indian society. Okay. So the word that is used is Adivasis. Okay. This is a Sanskrit word. So the equivalent in English would be Aboriginal people. All right, so you can think about Native Americans if you want to, but the better example would probably be the Australian Aboriginals. Okay, so Aboriginal people, forest dwellers, although literally the word means, Adi is a Sanskrit prefix, which means first. Okay, or in this case, original, and Vasis is dwellers. Okay, so the first dwellers, the first indigenous people to the country. The question that she's asked is a very, very good question. If we wanted to answer it in its long version, we'd have to do a whole course on that, because a question here would be, what is the relationship of these people to people who belong to the dominant Indian society, which would be caste Hindus? Okay, people who belong, because Adivasis are people who are supposed to be outside the caste system in some ways, all right? Because the caste system comes into India through the Aryans, right? But again, this is putting it a little too simply, because you know, according to the Indian Constitution, you have a group of people. They use two acronyms for them. Remember what I said to you about acronyms, right? Scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. Okay, scheduled, you know, you're wondering what the hell does that mean? What that means very simply is that these are people who are listed in a schedule or appendix to the Indian Constitution. So that's why they're called scheduled tribes and scheduled castes. Now, scheduled tribes are definitely what you would call Adivasis. And the idea is that these are people who are the original inhabitants of India, belonging to different tribal groups, just as there were different Native American groups. Very, very different groups, you know, okay? The Sioux and the Navajos are very different, for example, okay? Or the Cheyenne, or whichever group you can think of, and different linguistic groups. So similarly, you have different linguistic groups among the tribals or the Adivasis, and they're listed in the schedule to the Constitution, which means that they're entitled to certain protections, on paper, at least. Remember that all of this legislation, how it actually works itself out, how it's implemented is a different question, but in principle they are. And scheduled castes would be another group of people, but they're considered to have been more assimilated, if I may put it this way, into the dominant society, more Hinduized. So one way of understanding the distinction would be to say that the Adivasis, at least originally, were not within the strand of people who got assimilated into what becomes Hinduism. Okay? that would be the best way to answer your question. But as I said, there are complexities, and perhaps there'll be occasion to, look at them later on. But does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So do they belong to the group?
The Adivasis. The answer is yes. Some of them belong to none of the world's major religions. That is that they're not Christians, they're not Muslims, they're not Hindus, but some have been assimilated. So some of them have been converted. So you find levels of conversion of Adivasis into Christianity. Okay? So in fact, this has been a source of considerable tension and agitation in some parts of India, where the Hindu right-wing argument is that there is an aggressive attempt by Christian missionaries to proselytize among the Adivasis and to bring them within the fold of Christianity. Okay? Or Islam, some would argue, but Christianity seems to be the major issue here. Okay? But there are, in the case of Hinduism, it's a little bit more complicated, because there is no history of conversion in Hinduism. Right? So the Hindu right-wing view, and if you read the Nivedita Menon Aditya Nigam book, you know that she talks about, they talk about people who are no longer Hindus, but who they argue were Hindus, so they have to be brought back into the camp of Hinduism. So in other words, there is no provision for conversion in Hinduism, according to this argument, but there is a process for reconversion. Right? Reconversion. That is that they're people who were Hindus, then they are converted because of the aggressive proselytization in religions such as Islam and Christianity. That would be the argument. They are converted to those faiths. These people have now to be brought back to the true path, which is the path of Hinduism. And so therefore they should be subject to what is called Shuddhi, which means reconversion. But literally, again, the word Shuddhi is related to the word Shuddh, which means pure, the pure path, bring them back. Right? So you can see it's complicated. There's no conversion, that is, according to this mode of thinking in Hinduism, but there is reconversion. All right? Any other questions about this? All right. Now, at the point at which I had stopped on Tuesday, I had essentially mentioned to you two things. And one was I'd given you this argument, which I'm certain that some of you are still thinking is a little bizarre. Namely, I'm suggesting to you that you might want to think about development as not some unadulterated good, but maybe as a form of genocide too. Okay, I'm going to return to that in a moment. And the second was to suggest that if you look at the question of economic changes and reforms in India, that there are a whole set of indices we can use. And I suggested 5 or 6 that I'm going to talk to you about. Now, before I do either of them, let me tell you a little anecdote. Okay? And that anecdote pertains not just to the question under discussion now, but it pertains to the entire class and how you really should be thinking, or how in my view, you might profit from thinking about the question of knowledge and what does knowledge really mean. Now, when I was growing up in India, I went to a school called Springdale's, a very Anglo name, like you think about, right? Springdale's. All right? And this is when I was 13 years old in Delhi. And one of the subjects we had in that school was called GK. It's an actual subject. GK is general knowledge. Okay? So you have subjects such as geography, history, mathematics. Eva, did you have it in the? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Right? So anybody who's gone to a good public school, as they say, would have had GK. And so what did you learn in GK? The class met once a week. The capitals of all the countries in the world, you had to know that. I mean, the amount of things I memorized is astronomical, I can tell you. You had to know the 10 tallest mountains in the world, the 10 longest rivers, that sort of thing, okay? You just have to know it. And on the day of the exam, you had to make sure you read the newspapers in the morning, because there might be some new information, and you might get tested on that. And the new information in particular was that, you know, that the Indian cabinet, just as you have a cabinet here, right? So you have Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, et cetera, et cetera. In India, the cabinet gets reshuffled. That is that the Prime Minister makes a decision overnight for whatever reason that the person who's a Minister of Mines or Minister of Railways will now be the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And so, you know, you have to know who was the minister of every important department. And if you didn't read the newspapers in the morning, you could be in serious trouble because a cabinet might have been reshuffled overnight, and then in the morning the newspapers will tell you what the new portfolios is. So you have to know all of these things, okay? Right? And now when you do the capitals, it says the capital of the United States is Washington, comma, D.C. And would you believe it, if you check out all the almanacs. Remember, this is also the pre-internet age, so checking these things out took a little bit longer. You check all the almanacs and encyclopedias, none of them would actually spell out what DC meant. It always said capital of France, Paris, you know, of India, New Delhi, United States, Washington, DC. So I raised my hand, you know, one of these days in GK, and I said to the teacher, what does DC stand for? And she says, I really don't know. But it must be to distinguish it from Washington State, right? Washington, D.C. as opposed to Washington State. I said, well, that may be right, but that doesn't answer the question. What does D.C. stand for, right? And she says, well, I'll try to have an answer for you next week. Now, in the meantime, I go to the public library, and I'm frantically reading, you know, books on American history, trying to figure out what the hell this DC stands for. No American history book will actually tell me that, because they have to go to an encyclopedia, right? But in the meantime, I've learned about the history of the United States. And so next week, I come to class, and she says, Vinay, I have the answer for you. It's District of Columbia. I said, you're wrong. She says, really? What's your source of information? What do you think DC stands for? I said, discovered by Columbus. Right? I mean, America discovered by Columbus, right? And she had a good chuckle. She had a good laugh out of that one. Now, what's the point of that? Well, by the way, there are several different points. The first is, you're going to do the political and cultural history of contemporary South Asia post-1947. The culture of schooling is very important, exceedingly important. Who is shaping the economic policy of India? What kind of schools do these people come out? They come out of exactly the kind of school that I went to. Exactly that kind of public school. Public, by the way, in the British usage means private. For those of you who don't know, because when you think of public here, you're thinking of a state school. No. Public in British English means a private school. Okay? And these are all English medium schools. Okay? Right? So it's important to understand the culture of schooling, but the real point I want to make is a very different one. And I want to link it to the question of development and so on, and the kind of reading I was doing. What I want to suggest to you is this, that you see, I think there are different bodies of knowledge and different ways in which we understand what constitutes a body of knowledge. And one of the problems, I think, for all scholars and thinkers as well, and for anybody who's really interested in the life of the mind, is that I think that there is always something in a body of knowledge that we take for granted. So when you see that capital listed as Washington, D.C., it's assumed, A, that either you know what the D.C. is, and therefore you don't have to spell it out, or B, that it doesn't really matter, right? It's taken for granted. There is a grantedness about that body of knowledge. And in any discipline, there is something that is taken for granted, which means what? Which means that a consensus develops around a certain argument. And once that consensus has developed, or the consent of everybody has been given, implicitly or explicitly, then it's no longer necessary to examine that question. Okay? And when I say there are different kinds of knowledge, let me give you an illustration, you see. So, for example, when the British are in India, and this is related to the GK, you know, the 10 tallest mountains. You know, when the British are in India, they have this ambition. This ambition is that, okay, they see there are a couple of 100 mountains in India that are over 20,000 feet high. Virtually none of them has been given any name. Of course, the Indians have names for some of them, but those are not names that are intelligible, right, to the British. I mean, you know the tallest mountain in the world, right? Everest. Well, Everest is not an Indian name. And you have to rename everything in your own image. You rename it. And who is Everest? He's the conqueror. of Everest. Because, of course, for Westerners, it's not enough to look at it. You have to conquer it. Whatever there is out there, you have to conquer it. You have to dominate it. That's the only relationship you can have to something called nature out there. Now, when the British are in India, one of the great ambitions they have is they want to know the height of every single mountain. Whether it's 7,825 meters or 7,823 makes a difference, because then one is taller than the other. There's a hierarchy, right? You map the mountains. You give each of them a name, okay, and you find out the exact height. This is a body of knowledge. We are not interested in that kind of knowledge, frankly. What we're interested in is saying, okay, there's another way of looking at knowledge, and that is there's a consensus that has developed. The consensus that has developed is around the issue of development. That development is an absolute, unadulterated good, right? Nobody could possibly have anything problem with development. Yeah, you may have a problem with how it's carried out in a particular country. You may have a problem and say that, well, in some countries the development seems to be better than others because either the people are less hostile or more hostile, or maybe the development is a little bit more sensitive to the history of those people, right? Those are the kinds of debates. That's kind of tinkering around with the system. But you don't question that development is what they all need, okay? I'm suggesting to you that this is our task in this class here, that the bodies of knowledge that are taken for granted, I think you need to question those. Don't worry about finding out the height of the next mountain that has not been charted. Forget about it. Let's ask why the mountains were charted and mapped and named. That's more interesting, okay? And let's ask, why is it that this model of development was pushed forward, and with what consequences? Okay, and is there some other way? Because I think the logical question that's going to come next is, all right, so we have a critique of development here, so what do we put in its place? Do we have something that we can put in its place, you know, right? And somebody might say, I mean, for example, I think it was suggested, you know, that, well, South Korea is a country that has, you know, and by the way, I don't think it's an accident that South Korea was an authoritarian country, and it still is, because there is a relationship. And that is between development and authoritarianism. Remember why did we bring China into this whole discussion? Because an argument that has been made very often is that, well, you know, a country's path to development is better if it's not obstructed by democracy. Democracy is really messy. Why should we allow everybody a voice in what happens? You know, people have to be able to show that they're qualified to make a difference if they're going to contribute to a discussion. Some people will say that, right? And so I'm suggesting to you that there's this consensus that developed around this idea of development. And Arundhati Roy, with whom otherwise I have some differences, certainly, but I think that when she says that, hey, there was an unacknowledged war that's been taking place in India against the poor, and this unacknowledged war means that there are people who you decide are fit for development. So, for example, the Narmada Project, River Valley Project, which involves some huge dams and some small ones, a total of over 3,000 dams, not one single dam, okay? It's going to displace 22 million people. Well, these 22 million people that are going to be displaced, well, have they been consulted, right? And you say, well, they don't need to be consulted because it's for their good. And in fact, we need to be able to bring this project to fruition because its intent is to give 40 million people in Gujarat drinking water, right? That's part of the argument, right? But what about the 22 million? So who are these 22 million? They're tribals mainly. The question about who the tribals are, right? Significant percentage of people who are completely voiceless. And of course, the government has all of these promises, rehabilitation packages. We'll give you a rehabilitation package. We'll move you to some, you know, place. It's like moving you from here to, you know, the middle of Nevada, in the middle of nowhere, for example, right? Right? I mean, that's, what kind of rehabilitation are you talking about? If at all it happens. In many of these cases, it doesn't. It's been documented time and over again that these rehabilitation packages, most of them never materialize. When they do, they're wholly inadequate. and you shift people who have been attached to a certain piece of land for 1,000 years or more, and you shift them to some place which is 500 miles away without any means of survival. Right? What is that? Is that not genocide? That's the question. Again, you can say, well, we have to balance it in the scheme of things. Maybe this will help some other people. Maybe it will. The question is, who is dispensable and who is not? So I'll give you a very different illustration for a moment. Just a very different illustration. Radioactive wastes. Now, you know, radioactive wastes are a big problem for all countries such as the US, France, and Britain. Okay? Where do you think radioactive, what do they do with radioactive waste? Where are they buried? Do you think they're, yeah, mountains, and where else? Yeah, but are deserts and mountains absolutely empty, or are there communities living there? Are there people living there? Who's living there? It's not your urban elite. 90% of radioactive waste in the United States are buried in the proximity of the most poor communities in this country. Native American reservations. Because you see, once you've already decided, these people don't really matter. I mean, you can have multiculturalism and all of that, and you know, everybody will say, oh, you know, multiculturalism is wonderful, we should, you know, protect Native American culture, you know, let's watch their dance, this or that, whatever it is, you know, tourism, right? Okay, right? But the fact of the matter is that these people are completely disposable, dispensable. That is why you're not going to bury your radioactive waste in Beverly Hills. I mean, you know, where the most affluent white community is going to be living. Of course not. Somebody is going to pay the price. The question is, who is that person who's going to pay the price? Right? And we have to look at these as huge collectivities here. There is always a politics to these things. Right? So that is, I think, what you have to bear in mind when you look at the kind of argument that she's making. Okay? Now, having said that, so you see the point of the anecdote there, that is that we say that, look, there's a body of knowledge, but this body of knowledge assumes something. It assumes that we don't need to know what this DC stands for, or that it's not important. And I'm saying, let's take what is taken for granted and re-examine that, rather than trying to work with that other model of knowledge. That other model of knowledge is, well, we need more information about things, right? We need to continue to build blocks of information about all kinds of things, which is what most research is, by the way. You know, you just continue to have more information. So there are going to be another 100 scientists who are going to tell you something about global warming, and somebody will study one particular segment of the Antarctica, somebody will study acid rain in Canada, you know. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but the question here has to do with what is a conception that we have of this enterprise that we call knowledge seeking. All right, so now let's turn to the question of economic indices in India and how India has done, okay, with respect to the question of economic growth. All right, and recall that the post-1947 period was a period that is in the immediate aftermath of independence. It was a period of some kind of optimism. The country has achieved independence, right? And what does Nehru say? So he says on August 14th, 1947, that is the evening before independence, long years ago we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge. The achievement we celebrate today is but a step and opening of opportunity to the great triumphs and achievements that await us. And he reminds the country that the task ahead includes, quote, the ending of poverty and ignorance and disease and inequality of opportunity. Of course, he doesn't say and inequality, because he knows and everybody else knows that inequality is not going to be ended in his lifetime or anybody's lifetime, but inequality of opportunity, right? Okay, so now the question is, this is the pledge that he makes, and what is Nehru's vision? Nehru's vision is that what we need is, we need the state to invest as much as it can in the task of development. Okay? In fact, he's the one who came up with the idea that the new temples of India were the dams. Right? He says that explicitly in a speech. Okay? The temples, the dams are the new temples of India. Let's worship at these places, if I may put it this way, literally. Okay? And so what Nehru did was he set up a mechanism He borrows that from the Soviet Union, because like a lot of socialist leaders of his time, he turned to the Soviet Union. I mean, he had some reservations, obviously, about Stalinist Russia, no question about that. I think he recognized totalitarianism for what it was, but he also thought that there were some things that Soviet Russia had to offer to countries like India. And one of them was the conception of economic planning. See, I don't think Nehru completely understood at that point that there was an intrinsic relationship between the political system in the Soviet Union and the system of economic planning. In fact, it is economic planning that led to the kind of totalitarianism that eventually developed in the Soviet Union. But I don't think he had a full comprehension of that, so he took this idea of the 5-year plan. So India has 5-year plans, which means that there's a body of people called the Planning Commission. It's a high-powered body, right? You get appointed to the Planning Commission, and together the chair of the Planning Commission with the members of the Planning Commission creates an economic policy for India. The Planning Commission's influence has diminished in the post-1991 period, because that's a period when India started to introduce economic reforms and decided to embrace the principles of the free market economy, right? So you can see why the Planning Commission's influence would disappear, because now you don't want to leave decisions to some large, cumbersome body of people, right, who are still working in an old mode about protecting the economy and so forth and so on. But at least from 1947 until 1991, it's safe to say, and in fact for several years after that, it's safe to say that the Planning Commission was the most authoritative body for determining the economic policies of the government of India. And the economic policies of India was that India was not really partaking in the free market economy. What you do is you protect your economy, okay, import substitution as it's called, right? And India, of course, did not really have a substantial share of either the world's imports or exports at that point in time, okay? This is, by the way, a very dramatic situation from what India was like, because I think it's necessary to add as a little footnote, and then you can sort of think about it a little bit more on your own. But I don't think you should assume from the situation of the economy in 1947, when India was really, really impoverished, that India had always been that way. In fact, in 1750, right, as much recent work has suggested, it's safe to say that around 1750, the economy of the world was basically carved up between India, China, and Europe, 1/3 each, roughly, right? And in some ways, we may be returning to that now. It may be possible that we may be moving in that direction now. You can substitute Europe with the West, including the United States, okay? It's possible. I think that's too optimistic, but that's certainly the direction that things are going, is that India and China are obviously emerging as major economies. All right, so this is the general scenario that you want to keep in mind. Now, let's look at a few specific questions. Food, okay, and agricultural production. And before I give you some numbers, right, I want you to think about it, again, in a slightly more expansive way, right? Because I think the question is not simply one of, all right, what percentage of the population now has access to food? Okay, is India self-sufficient, right? And so we know that in the last 60 years, food production has gone up from about 50 million tons to 200 million tons, okay? Wheat, right? So fourfold increase, very substantial. And you remember that I talked a little bit about the system of ration shops, fair price shops as they're called, as some kind of distribution network so that people could buy, that is, people who had access to the system to begin with. Because if you were obviously living at the rock bottom of Indian society, let's say you're a slum dweller, okay, or let's say you're living on the streets, okay, in some impoverished rural area, then even that access to the fair price shops or the ration shops did not exist for you. But if you were a little bit above that, if you were in the lower middle class, for example, or even if you were in the slum but you were enterprising, okay, then you had access to these fair price shops, which meant that every month, depending on the size of your family, right, you would have access to a certain amount of wheat, rice, sugar, kerosene oil, okay, right, for the use of the family every month. Right? That's what a fair price shop entitled you to do. That system has slowly collapsed after the opening up of the free market economy. I'm not saying it's completely disappeared, but it does not work anywhere near to the levels that it used to before 1991. Right? But when we think about the question of food and agricultural production, I think it's also necessary to think about how food habits have changed in India. Okay, so for example, if you came from, let's say, a North Indian middle class family of the kind that I came from, the pattern was very clear. You had chicken once a week, and that was usually on a Sunday, because it meant that, you know, the child could go with his or her father, right, to the butcher's, and you get some chicken, and you had chicken once a week. One of the astonishing changes, and people will say it's a sign of progress, it's a sign of affluence. See, this is why I think it's important to keep these stories in mind. Okay, and what is one of the most astonishing changes? The levels of consumption of meat in India have grown astronomically in the last 15 years, right? And of course, you know that there's a trend in some parts of the world, to a very strong trend, to argue that we should reduce our dependence on meat. We should reduce our dependence on meat because it takes 10 times as much land, okay, to get the beef you want, for example, as it takes to get the same amount of caloric content if you are growing wheat or potatoes or something else. Right? Because, of course, you know, in order to get that beef, you first have to have so much land that is devoted to the growth of other things. Right? And then the question has to do with how much water does it take, okay, to grow certain kinds of crops or to raise livestock, so forth and so on. So if you go to North India, right, to the more impoverished areas, even wheat consumption is very, very minimal there. They eat mainly barley and millet, because the amount of water it takes from the ground to grow that is minuscule compared to the amount of water you need in order to have either rice or wheat. Right? So I think that it's not simply a question of numbers. We'll have to ask, how have habits of consumption changed? What kind of food are people eating? And when you start eating too much meat, then you start getting into the diseases of the rich. So what we're going to find is that medical care in India is going to now get transformed. And it is slowly getting transformed. Okay? We know that the number of people who have reached levels of obesity, real severe obesity in India, has grown tremendously. There's enough data on these questions in the last 15 years. So affluence is coming with a price, which means that now you do not suffer from the diseases of the poor only, such as TB, okay, tuberculosis, right, or typhoid, right? You now start suffering from the diseases of the rich, and those include heart diseases, obesity, right? Cardiac surgery in India has grown astronomically. One of my favorite stories about that is that, you know, one of the big folk heroes in Delhi, for those of you who have families in Delhi, just go and ask your parents. One of the big folk heroes, he's like sort of the Michael Jordan and Shaq O'Neal and whatever, you know, of Delhi, is a heart surgeon. He's like a household name. Naresh Trehan is his last name, Trehan. He's invited to every dinner party you can think of in Delhi, because he's like a hero. Why? The guy has done 20,000 heart surgeries. Because if you one sign of being in the middle class in India now is having a bypass surgery. It's almost like a badge of honor. If you're an Indian male and you're 50, you've got to have a bypass surgery, you know, right? And who does this? Trehan. He's like the king, you know. As I said, a folk hero in Delhi. Amazing. Every middle class family knows this guy, you know. Okay? And why are you having this problem? It has to do in part with changing lifestyles, has to do in part with changing diets, the kind of nutrition you have, right? So that's what I'm suggesting. Let's not only think about numbers, but when we look at the story of food and food production, and this is where the Amartya Sen's book really fails, because its whole story about economic growth and progress has to do with numbers, basically, right? This is what's happening. This is the increase in production. This is who's getting access to it. But it's not looking into the cultural history of food. Okay? And you have to look at the cultural history of food and agricultural production. So let's look at that as well now. Right? One of the things I mentioned to you, there have been no famines in India in the post-1947 period. And I think that is unquestionably something that speaks to the strength of the Indian record here. Namely that I think that, yes, that whatever the problems there have been, and acute problems, but I think the problem of famine has been arrested. That does not mean that the problem of starvation deaths has been arrested. There's a difference between the two, and the difference has to do with the fact is that when you speak about a famine, you speak about some kind of event on a scale which affects a large collectivity. Okay, if 20 people die in a slum because they don't have access to food, or die over a period of time because they're malnutrition, that is not a famine. But those nonetheless are starvation deaths, and you do continue to have starvation deaths. You do continue to have malnutrition. I think there I'd given you the figures before. Over 50% of the population of India suffers from malnutrition. Okay, and again the numbers, will depend on who's giving it to you and what source they are using, which kind of sampling survey they used, right? But minimum 50%, absolutely unquestionably true. And the figures could be much larger. It could be closer to 70, 75%. Because if indeed 80% of the population of India is living under less than $2 a day, right? And that figure is not disputed, $2. I mean, some people would say only 20 rupees a day, as I mentioned to you last time. Then it's very clear that a substantial portion of these people are not having access to food. One way, by the way, in which you judge it is you simply look at caloric content. Right? And so the standard that has been set by the UN is 2,200 calories, right? That a person needs 2,200 calories a day, right? And somewhere between, you could say, they shift slightly different shifting standards. The U.S. Food and Agricultural Organization the FDA, for example, uses a 2,000 calorie count, right? And then we're not even looking at what percentage of that is derived from fats, and what kind of fats and what percentage is derived from proteins, et cetera, right, so forth and so on. Okay, but what we're saying is that if you're taking the 2,200 calorie count, it is clear that much less than 50% of the population has that minimum daily requirement. And of course, it has to be over a period of time that you don't have it, because if you don't have it for one day, let's say you go on a fast for 2 days, well, that's not going to determine that you're malnutritioned. You would have to not have that 2,200 calories over a sufficient period of time in order for you to be classified as somebody who is malnutrition, right? And if you're looking at that record of famine, I think it's important to bear in mind, I mentioned this in my very first lecture, or maybe the second one, but I did mention it, namely that there was a famine in India in 1943, 4 years before the British left India, that accounted for at least 2 to 2.5 million lives in the province of Bengal. Okay, right? And we know that while this famine was taking place, the British were exporting grain from Bengal to other parts of the world. And I think that this is one measure of what it means to be a subservient nation. That when you're a subservient nation under some other colonial power, it means that there is no kind of sovereignty that you exercise over your own products, your own life, right? And so I think in these respects, there is no question that there has been some substantial improvement. And generally, to add another dimension to it, very often this history of the increase of food production in India has been written as a history where you've had two significant phases. And here I want to say not just food production, but increase in what you might describe as other sources of nutrition and so forth. So you had, number one, the White Revolution in India. What I mean by the White Revolution is a dramatic increase in the production of milk. Takes place in Western India, to begin with. Takes place in Gujarat, Maharashtra, okay, through cooperatives, right? In fact, there's this butter that is sold in India, advertised all over. It's called Amul, A-M-U-L. Everybody who's lived in India knows Amul butter, okay? Well, this comes out of a cooperative, the Anand Cooperative, which is based in Gujarat, okay? And I can tell you that even as late as the early 1970s, I mean, I remember this distinctly growing up, as late as the early 1970s, mid-1970s, there were acute shortages of milk and milk products such as butter, which meant that you had to stand in line, it was rationed, it would take half an hour to get 1 liter of milk. Those days are gone, right? Because you've had an enormous production in increase in production of milk. In fact, India is the largest milk producing country in the world today. Okay, so there have been significant shifts, right? And partly that has to do with, for example, what are the farming methods that are used, dairy farming methods that are used? Have you had new breeds of cattle? Have there been crossbreeds, for example? Okay, but to understand this, let's look at the second. Remember I said there were two significant phases. So let's look at the second one, because there we have a big body of critical literature which has suggested that we should look at that very different. That is the so-called Green Revolution that takes place in India. Okay, so these are phrases that are used in the literature very widely, the Green Revolution particularly. Substantial literature about it. What is the Green Revolution? A substantial increase in the production of wheat in particular, okay, in North India, right? Okay, why did this happen? Under what circumstances did this happen? And is this an unadulterated good now? Okay, so this is where we are beginning to develop a critical body of literature, right? So here's the Punjab. This is where it occurs. Okay, so Punjab is like one of the major agricultural, areas, right? And the Green Revolution was made possible by what? It was made possible by new seeds, increased use of fertilizer, okay, increased use of fertilizer, mechanized farming, right? So and by the way, what does that mean? Think of it, right? The minute you hear mechanized farming, it means that the farm has to be big enough, which meant that you needed to have some consolidation of farms and lands in the Punjab. Because if you're talking about everybody has a small half acre of land, as in Kerala, right, where I said, remember that I mentioned to you that, with one stroke of the pen, almost literally the communists were able to achieve land reform, okay, which meant that every family had a certain stretch of land, right? But if you've got very small pieces of land, you cannot efficiently use things like tractors, large tractors, okay? The farms have to be of a sufficient size for you to be able to do that. So in the Punjab, you had consolidation of land, mechanized farming, new seeds, okay, increased use of fertilizers, pesticides, right? And eventually, over a period of time, what you saw a very substantial increase in the production of wheat. Very, very substantial. This model would then be emulated in other parts of the country as well, right? The person who's the author of the Green Revolution is actually an American scientist, Norman Borlaug, who was an advisor to the Indian government, right? And to understand what that meant to India, okay, you have to understand that India was importing very substantial amounts of wheat in order to be able to feed its own population throughout the 1950s and the 1960s. And where is it importing it from? Largely from the United States. Okay? And for somebody like myself, this has ramifications that you would never even dream of. And I'll give you a very simple illustration of that, okay? Because again, it's part of the cultural history of what are the repercussions of this, and now the repercussions have nothing to do with food and what you eat. When India imported these huge amounts of wheat, so it paid the Americans in rupees, right? The rupee is a non-convertible currency. You cannot carry the rupee around with you and expect that anybody in Singapore is going to trade it, right? Or in the US or UK. It's a non-convertible currency, which means you have to use it in India. You can't export your rupees. And the Americans now have these billions and trillions of rupees, and they don't know what to do with them, right? So what the Americans did was, they set up, among other things, but this is one big project. It's called PL 480 project. PL is Public Law 480. Okay? They set up a Library of Congress office in India, and the Library of Congress decided that it would acquire the largest collection of books about India that you could dream of. So the Library of Congress decided that they were going to buy 40 copies of every English language book published in India, 40, and 15 copies of every other book published in India, whether it's in Oriya, Bengali, Tamil, Marathi, Gujarati, Kannada, you name it, they have it. 15 copies of every book. Okay? Remember, this is that kind of knowledge, the 10 longest rivers, the 10 tallest mountains, what do you want to do? You want to create an encyclopedia of information that you can. You want to be able to master the world. Now we've gone beyond the food, but this is, where's the money coming from? It's coming from the imports, right, of wheat. And the Indian government is now paying the Americans in rupees. They can't spend the rupees elsewhere, so they say, okay, this is what we're going to do with the rupees. And then what do they do with these 15 copies? They ship them back to the US to 13 designated libraries. 13 university libraries in the US have virtually every book published in India in the last 60 years. No library in India has it. Not a single library in India can afford that. And there are 13 libraries in the US have that. Okay? And 2 copies went to the Library of Congress, right? And so you go to the University of Chicago library, I mean, the entire 5th floor, I mean, there are like 20,000 novels in Oriya, which nobody has ever read. Somewhere along that, some PhD student will come along and will decide to do a dissertation on the Oriya novel, or the Bengali novel, or whatever it is. And bang, there you got the whole collection, right? Question over there.
What were the dates for the wet and green?
This is 60s, 1950s, 1960s. Okay? So they have an acquisition office. Now that program is going to slowly diminish. Only in recent years has it really diminished because, but the rupees were lasting for such a very long period of time, earning interest as well, of course. Right, okay? Right? So you can see that when you start doing the cultural history of these kinds of things, you can't assume that when you're talking about food, you are confined solely to that, right? There is a whole network here. Right? And so this network would include then what is the relationship of these kinds of imports, okay, to very different kinds of questions, such as what kind of knowledge seeking was going on among the Americans when they decided to establish these collections. All right? But that's pretty much what I want to say here, except for this one last single element. Because recall what I said, that the Green Revolution has come in for a lot of criticism. What kind of criticism has it come in for? It has come in for a criticism which has several different registers to it, or several different aspects to it. One of which is political. That we're going to say for later on when we look at the Punjab, and we look at the political disturbances in the Punjab. Because what this Green Revolution did in the Punjab was it created a new class of extremely wealthy farmers and created new kinds of class inequalities. I'm not saying that class inequalities didn't exist. Of course they existed. But a new category of class inequalities, new segment of people who are greatly resented. And the Punjab is going to become the site of the most ferocious secessionist battles in India in the 1970s and 1980s, right? So the big secessionist movement, breakaway movement, that's going to take place is going to take place in the Punjab. It has a relationship to the Green Revolution, because the Green Revolution, I'm suggesting to you, yes, it increased food production, all of that, okay, but it created a new segment, a new class of people who became extremely wealthy. That's the political aspect of it. Now there are other aspects. One of the things that happens in a Green Revolution is that you increase the area under irrigation. So in India, basically, when you're doing when you look at agriculture, okay, and you're looking at agricultural crops, there are basically 2 sources of water. One is rain-fed, okay, and that is not entirely reliable. It's not entirely reliable because some parts of the country get very little rain. They're drought-stricken, okay. There are other parts of the country that may get adequate rainfall or even excess rainfall, but their agriculture is dependent on the monsoon. It's called the monsoon, okay. In North India, you have one monsoon. Monsoon season is basically, used to be mid-June till, I would say, early August. That's changed, actually, I would say, in the last 15 years. The monsoon now tends to come later, okay. And sometimes it's longer. When I was in India for 18 months recently, spent the entire, summer, last summer. And the monsoon season there was much longer. The rains are going on until September. And they're starting, in some cases, early May. But generally the monsoon, you get one monsoon North India. South India, you get 2 monsoons, okay, right? So the problem is that when your agriculture is highly dependent on that, you can have failures of the monsoon. If the monsoon doesn't come on time, right, then you've got a problem. Now, Now in India, the last 10, 15 years, the monsoon has been very good. Very, very good. So it's been a lucky time for the farmers. But where the agriculture is dependent not on rain water, but on irrigation water, then what you get is you get waterlogging. Right? So where you have excessive irrigation, one problem, and that's a problem that's occurred in Punjab. Along the canals, you get waterlogging. You also get increased incidence of malaria. Increased incidence of malaria. Because wherever you have bodies of water that are relatively stagnant, it becomes a breeding ground for malarial mosquitoes. Right? I'm giving you several problems now. Right? Increasing incidence of malaria, increasing class inequalities, different registers now, different medical problems, and of course the agricultural patterns may change, the kind of crops that you grow, because now if you know that you actually have a short supply of water, right, because the Green Revolution also meant that the irrigation facilities were increased dramatically, right? If you know you have that, you may start growing your food not for the local market but for the international market. So you're going to grow crops that you think are going to be much more productive. I mean, one of the extraordinary changes that has taken place in India, I mean, 20 years ago, nobody in India had ever heard of, unless they had lived in the West, nobody had ever heard of broccoli. It's not an Indian vegetable. You just don't get it. Nobody had ever heard of it. Brussels sprouts. And now you go to the middle-class areas of Delhi, broccoli is widely available. Your vegetable vendor is bringing it along with his potatoes and onions, the standard stuff. Well, when did this all occur? Again, a change in eating habits and patterns, right? And when you begin to think that a certain vegetable is associated with the elite or with countries of the affluent West, then some people start to say, well, maybe we should start eating it here too. Right? So when you look at this story, I would urge you to keep all of these considerations in mind. Let's move to the second element, education. I think there is no question that the record of India is absolutely appalling in the domain of primary education. I mean, this is just an unmitigated disaster. An unmitigated disaster. And there are documentaries that I could show you, reports that I could give you access to, schools in Rajasthan, which are schools only in name, because for 6 months the teacher has not turned up, although the teacher is collecting his salary. Okay? I mean, in India, they're very good at these kinds of things, if I may be a little bit ironical about it. They're absolutely smart about it, street smart about it. You collect your salary and never show up, or you only show up on the 1st of the month or the 7th of the month, right, to collect your paycheck, right? And this is the story of district after district in some parts of the country. And the literacy rates, I mean, the Menon book says in 2001 the literacy rate is 68 or 69%, something like that, with a differential between male and female literacy of about 20%. Okay, I think those numbers are inflated, right? Because we've already talked about that. What does it really mean to describe a person as being literate? To what extent can they read or write, so forth and so on, right? But even if you take that, even if you take that 70% seriously, I don't think you can, but even if you do, we're still saying that 60 years after independence, that's a pretty appalling record. And then again, the question is that if you look at primary education, secondary education, we will also have to ask not what the whole numbers are now, but what are the numbers for particular communities, right? Just as we have to ask, okay, so we say that 20% of the population of Delhi has access to safe, tapped drinking water. Safe there is relative, okay? Because if you had the means, you would filter the water, all right? But let's say tapped drinking water. So we say 20%. But that's a round number here, a whole number. Within that 20%, we'll find out that the upper class had much greater access than people living in the slums, right? What percentage of people living in the slums actually had access to that? I'm giving you a random figure. I'm not saying it is 20%. I'm just saying take a hypothetical example. Similarly, we're going to have to say, when we look at education, so we say that certain percentage of the population of India has access to schools. right? Then we're going to have to say, well, what about the Dalits? What percentage of the lower caste, Dalits? What percentage of Dalit women? Let's even complicate it more. I bet you there are districts of Rajasthan and UP, okay, in North India, where Dalit women, the rate of literacy cannot be more than 2 to 3%. Impossible that it could be higher than 2 or 3% in some of these districts, right? Okay, so we can parse the numbers further, and we can say that this is what's really happening. And there's an enormous variation, and that's why I gave you the illustration of the state of Kerala over here, okay? Because Kerala has, as I said, 100% or close to 100% literacy rate. And if you read the Amartya Sen argument in the Argumentative Indian, right, the reading that you had, the 10-page reading you had from last week, I think it was, I mean, he gives a very interesting argument. So he says, if you look at the state of Kerala, so basically it's, how was the state of Kerala? Because the state of Kerala did not exist before the linguistic reorganization of Indian states, right? So how was the state of Kerala put together? It was put together by adding 3 districts, okay? Cochin, Travancore, okay, and Malabar, right? And sometimes it has been argued that the reason why Kerala has this higher rate is not simply because of what the communists did and the fact that the communists were very keen on introducing literacy, right, emancipating the working class, so forth and so on, but that even long before the communists came into power, in the 19th century, the rulers of Cochin and Travancore, so Cochin and Travancore are native states, which you know what that means now, since we had talked about it. So these are native states, right? The rulers of these 2 native states were more progressive, according to the argument that Amartya Sen is talking about, okay? Malabar is taken from, it's a district taken from the Madras presidency, okay, and it's added on, and these 3 become, but Malabar, just let me continue with my train of thought. So Malabar, however, comes from a different part of the country, if I may put it this way, and it was not under these enlightened rulers. But what Amartya Sen finds out is that once you've added this Malabar to Cochin and Travancore, and you've melded all of these into one single state, you find that the rates of literacy in Malabar are as high as they are in Cochin and Travancore, okay? So therefore that means that whatever prior history there might have been, okay, of enlightened rulers making available education to their subjects, that cannot be decisive. It cannot explain fully. I'm not saying, and he's not saying that it's unimportant, but it cannot explain. Why? You have now literacy across all the 3 districts, including a district that was formerly under the Madras presidency, right? Okay, Natalie, you had a question.
Yes. I was just wondering, is this the state too that had a tradition of passing property through maternity?
Yes, matrilineal. Matrilineal. It could be. The past would include all of that. We would, if we started looking at the history of Kerala, you know, because one of the things that people in the development industry argue, and I think this is not incorrect, although you don't have to be in the development industry to know that. All you have to know is folk tales from India, and you would know that. And that is that if you're going to increase education, start with the women, right? It's a common wisdom of people who work in development and development area work. You start with women because the children are going to learn largely from women. So if at all you had scarce resources, you could only educate a certain people, it's more important to educate your women. Of course, in principle, everybody knows that, nobody does it. Let's not worry about that right now, okay? Right? But because, you know, what you know about a culture, what you know about a tradition, usually you learn it from your mother, from your grandmother, particularly in these kinds of traditions. That's been done for a very long period of time, right? Okay, so that's important. Matrilineal property, which meant that women had more autonomy. That's what it means. That's the real significance. Had more economic power, probably, okay? And therefore, it could be that maybe literacy rates for women were always much higher, you see, right? I think that that's absolutely important. But again, he's suggesting that, look, and this is where the problem comes in, he's suggesting that whatever the reasons for why certain portions of what is now Kerala were more progressive before, higher rates of literacy right from the beginning, but then we added to this mix a district which did not have those advantages, and yet we find that that district has now up to par is now up to par with the other two districts. So therefore, it means that the state policy here has been very different. It has been pursued in a different way than it has been and in other parts of India, such as this place called Rajasthan over here, right? Okay, or UP over here, where, as I said, the rates of literacy are much, much lower, and when you get to Dalit women and so on, appallingly low, Okay, so this is part of the picture. Now let's look at the other side of the picture. The other side of the picture is that one of the things that India claims, and maybe justly so, is that it has the second largest pool of scientists and engineers in the world. And you encounter these stories all the time. My next door neighbor in Encino, he sort of thinks that every Indian is a doctor. Because every time he's gone to a hospital, he's treated by an Indian for some, and this guy's got a whole slew of ailments, from his head to his feet, which means he's got 8 different specialists attending to him, a cardiologist, neurologist, you name it, right? And Indians. So when he heard that I had a PhD, he said, "Oh, you must be a doctor too." I said, "No, I'm not that kind of doctor. I just attend to diseases of the soul. That's all," right? So where did that impression come from? Because you have a large segment of the Indian education industry devoted to institutions of higher education. And the most famous ones are these IITs, they're called. Okay? Indian Institute of Technology. Right? Interesting history. We don't have time to get into it, unfortunately. But the IITs, roughly 50% of the graduates of IITs live in the United States. Okay, so you've had this problem, what is called brain drain. I take a different view of that, as I do of most of these things, because some of these people would not have done much good in India anyhow, so it's better if they leave. No problem at all, frankly, as far as I'm concerned, right? But here you've got this 50%, and over a period of 50 years, you're talking about 20, 30,000. And it has been estimated that 10% of all startups in Silicon Valley, 10% of all startups were done by IIT graduates. Just one small segment of people called IIT graduates, right? Okay, so, you're talking about a group of people here who have graduated from leading institutions, and it is very clear that a decision was made in India, I think early on, to invest disproportionately a large amount of money in higher education. And primary education suffered. So partly it's a matter of budget allocation. Partly it's a problem of that. Partly it's a problem of priorities. What priorities the Indian state had. I think that one of the reasons it took that decision was that it wanted to be able to compete in the world market right from the beginning. And I think they figured that if you can get enough people into these so-called world-class institutions who can make a difference, that is going to put India on the world map. If you go the way of primary education, that's very slow. Building up that base is very slow, right? And again, I don't think that's really what I would describe as thinking that has been validated, because you could take the example of Cuba, which really did both. And I think that somebody had mentioned, quite rightly so, but we'd have to assess whether, in fact, that objection is, or that point is a point that is really, all influential. And namely, that point was that, well, Cuba is a relatively small country, very small country, so we're talking about much smaller numbers. But we know that what happened was that after the Cuban Revolution, within a period of 5 years, they were able to attain virtually universal literacy in Cuba. And not only that, right? So not only is there an investment in primary education, but we know that, in fact, Cuba produced a large segment of people like doctors. In fact, Cuban doctors are famous all over the world, because whenever you have a medical crisis, you had an earthquake in Pakistan 2 years ago, you got Cuban doctors going over there. Not to mention countries which are much closer in South America and so on, right? Bolivia, Peru, where again you've had Cuban doctors who have been quite important, right? So you could do both. But in India, I think that the calculation was that, well, we don't know whether we can do both or not, but at least we can put India on the world map by having these IITs and so on. The problem here in part has to do with the fact that it is still a minuscule portion of the population of India that gets affected. Minuscule portion. And the IIT exams are very, very competitive. In the last IIT exam, Ira, do you know the numbers?
No, but I know it's very high.
You know how many? Because there's a standard uniform exam. Okay? I mean, you think getting into Harvard is tough. Check this out. In the last comprehensive uniform exam for IIT, over 500,000 people took that exam. You know for how many seats? How many seats are available? Make a guess. And now there, by the way, now there are 7 IITs. There used to be only 5. Okay, now there's 7, right? You think there are like 20,000 seats, you know, 500,000 people? No. Right? 10,000? No. Much, much lower. You're talking about, at the most, 1,500 seats. And over 500,000 people taking that exam. Okay? So this is the kind of competition we're talking about. This is part of the history of contemporary South Asia. This whole culture of exam taking, education, okay? What kind of, and you know that once you pass that exam, okay, you think, and you've entered the IITs, you know, you think you're a king, right? So, you know, I think we'd have to understand what kind of educational system, what is the country has, what is its relationship to the political system, to the economic growth. These are not different segments, okay, that you can just take in isolation, right? You have to take them together to try to understand what is a place of, because these IIT graduates obviously are going to be highly influential. And many of them, as I said, migrate overseas eventually, you know, once they finish their degree, either for higher degrees or for, you know, starting up something, you know, becoming a venture capitalist, whatever it is, right? But many of them, of course, continue on in India. And you've also found, I mean, that's an interesting part of the culture of the IITs. It's like the very, very elite institutions in the US, you know, like the Ivies, for example, that the same institutions also have, it seems to me, a disproportionately higher number of people who are interested in social projects, who have a kind of a social conscience, right? So one of the groups that was started at the IITs, and in fact UCLA has a branch, okay? If you don't know about it, it's called SPIC-McKay. There's a branch at UCLA, Society for the Preservation of Indian Classical Music Among Youth. Okay? That's what SPIC-McKay is. Where did it start? It started at the IITs. So these are people who are completely committed to modernity and so on, right? Interesting, right? And yet there's a strong interest in them that they should want to preserve or enhance Indian traditions, right? In areas such as the arts, music, so forth. We'll have to think about this a little bit more later on, because we're going to have to try to understand how do people inhabit different spaces in their mind in this at the same time. Okay? Right? So this is the culture that I'm talking about. The nutshell of it is that we are saying that literacy levels in India remain very low, very substantial difference between rural and urban areas, very substantial difference between men and women, even more substantial between rural women. So let's say Dalit rural women, okay, the rates of literacy, right, will be a fraction of what they are for urban upper caste males living in Delhi or Bangalore or whatever. A fraction, a small fraction, okay? But this doesn't mean, let me finally add that, this does not mean that there is a relationship between higher levels of literacy and the kind of political vision that a person has. I want to insist on that. I want to give you 2 illustrations of that. We have found repeatedly in studies that have been done in India, repeatedly, time and over, that the people who are most acutely conscious about Hindu-Muslim differences and who then want to act on these differences, sometimes to the extent that they embrace violence, that the people who are most acutely conscious of this are the highly educated in India. Communalism is a problem among the educated elite in India, much more so than it is among the uneducated in India, right? And when we look at the problem of communalism, we look at that in slightly greater detail. But this has been demonstrated in study after study. And so then you have to ask, well, if you have these rates of literacy among the urban, male population, or urban population in general, male and female, right? What good is that if you're going to have much higher degrees of religious animosity among the same people? And could it be that they have this because to be educated in part means to acquire the paraphernalia of certain forms of knowledge such as history? You become much more conscious of the past, and you become much more conscious of what you think are historical wrongs done to you by members of the other community, right? Worthwhile thinking about it. And the second illustration was that, I mentioned that before, if you look at Indian elections, what we find is that in India, the urban middle class elite, for the most part, does not vote. It has washed its hands off politics in that sense. It wants to influence politics behind the scenes, okay? It is really people, the levels of voting among the uneducated are much higher in India and in the rural areas than they are among the educated urban elite. And so this leads me to the point that I want to make, on which I want to end. I'm going to continue. We're not completely finished with the discussion. I'll get to you in a second, yeah? I'm not completely done with the discussion about economic reforms and changes, because I haven't gotten to the last phase yet, and that has to do with globalization, outsourcing. And these indices that I gave you, the 5, I mean, I've only looked at 2 of them in detail, so I'm going to take a couple of minutes to describe each of them in the next lecture, and then move on to a discussion of globalization and farmer suicides. 200,000 farmers have committed suicide in India since 1997. Read it on the internet if you want to. 200,000. Okay? So if you've had this enormous food production, you've had India shining, as they say, emerging and so on, why have 200,000 farmers committed suicide? Yeah. Since 1997. 200,000. So the point on which I want to end is this. So remember I was telling you that, look, the urban middle class elite is not the one that's voting for the most part. So I want to raise for your consideration this point and end there. I'm going to suggest to you that one way to understand India today is to come to the awareness that the elite have opted out of India and have opted out of the state. When I say they have opted out, what I mean is that they basically have decided that they are going to use all the means at their disposal, private and otherwise, not rely on state services to advance their own interests. That the collective interest of the nation is not what is important. What is important is their own advancement, and their own advancement is best procurable, possible, by, in fact, opting out of the state. So opting out of the state means you don't use the services of the state to the extent that is possible, right? So you don't use, for example, in India, in the middle class, they don't use the postal service any longer. That's only for the poor now. You know what they use? Courier delivery. Everything is by courier delivery, from your telephone bill to your book catalog. Yeah, courier delivery. These are all private services. You simply opt out of the state. You do not use, the telephone services of MTNL. MTNL is Mahanagar Telephone Nigam Limited. That's a state-run organization. You use telephone services by private enterprises. Airtel, for example, right? No matter which domain you look at, it is very clear that they've opted out. And in fact, they've opted out to the degree that they are creating these special enclaves for the rich, for the affluent, for the middle class. Okay? And by these enclaves, I don't mean the kinds of places I was talking about last time when I concluded my last lecture, when I talked about, Beverly Hills Garden, in Delhi, or in Ghaziabad, right? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what are called special economic zones. So I'm going to talk about that on Tuesday. the creation of special economic zones in India, and what this really means as well, right? So these are the things that we're going to touch upon before moving to the readings and lectures for week 4. Now, there was a question over here very briefly. You had a?
Yeah, I was just wondering, because you were saying that the uneducated rural areas have higher voting.
Yeah, they do.
Is that due to being paid for their vote? Is that not?
No, not really. I mean, there's some of that may be occurring. It may be occurring in urban areas too. It has to do with greater investment in the future. That that to some degree you think that, look, maybe this does make a difference, that they have not become entirely cynical about the democratic process.